picture, for just a moment, picture the ultimate saintly figure. You probably see the homespun white clothes, the simple wooden walking stick.
Yeah, the round, wire-rimmed spectacles.
Exactly. And above all, this universal, uncompromising message of nonviolence. I mean, in India, he's revered as the father of the nation, a Mahatma, a great soul.
Right. It's an image that is just instantly recognized anywhere on the planet for, gosh, nearly a century now. That visual has basically functioned as global shorthand for absolute moral purity and, well, the triumph of peace over empire.
But what if the man behind that flawless myth, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, was actually harboring a reality so deeply intertwined with controversy and prejudice and just extreme personal obsession that it shatters that entire curated image?
That's a huge question.
It is. So today, the mission of this deep dive is to look past the whispered rumors and the textbook summaries. We are going to examine the uncomfortable truth of a man defined by profound and, honestly, often damaging contradictions.
Yeah, we really have to look at the actual human being.
All right, so we are pulling from a massive stack of sources today. We've got historical excerpts, Gandhi's own personal letters, his private diaries, heavily critical texts from his contemporaries, and of course, extensive debates from modern historians. We're totally setting the myth aside.
And just a quick note for you listening as we dive into this material today. We are dealing with some incredibly charged historical texts.
Very charged.
Yeah. The sources we're unpacking cover highly sensitive issues surrounding race, the caste system, and colonial history. So our goal here isn't to take a political side or to endorse the historical viewpoints found in these texts, nor are we here to validate the modern critiques of them.
Right, exactly.
We are strictly here to impartially unpack the ideas contained in this historical material, just laying out exactly what the sources say so you can understand the full, unvarnished picture for yourself.
Because, human nature's funny. We all have this collective instinct to put our historical heroes on these impossible towering pedestals.
Oh, absolutely. We freeze them in time.
Yeah, as perfect icons.
Mm-hmm.
But taking them down from those pedestals and actually looking at their flaws reveals a far more fascinating, complex reality. And to understand the leader who brought the British Empire to its knees, we have to start with the man himself. Specifically, we have to look at his absolute consuming obsession with spiritual discipline.
Right. And to truly grasp the depth of that obsession, the sources point us toward his most intensely private and arguably most controversial practices.
The ones later in his life.
Exactly.
Okay?
Later in his life, particularly as the political violence around Indian independence escalated, Gandhi engaged in what he called brahmacharya experiments.
Which, on the surface, translates to celibacy.
It does, yeah. But in Gandhi's interpretation, it wasn't just celibacy. It was an extreme test of spiritual power.
And the details of these tests, which are documented in his own diaries, are deeply disturbing. He would sleep completely naked in the same bed as young women. And the detail that completely stopped me in my tracks reading through this material was that one of the young women involved in these intimate experiments was his own grandniece, Manu Gandhi.
Right. It's shocking. But the historical context behind why he did this is crucial to understanding his mindset.
Okay, unpack that for us.
So Gandhi subscribed to a very specific philosophical belief that his personal physical purity was directly tied to his political power, what he called satyagraha, or truth force.
Wait, so he thought his physical purity literally affected national politics?
Yes, exactly. He believed that if he could completely conquer physical desire, he would generate a spiritual energy so potent it could literally stop the violence tearing India apart.
Wow.
So to test his self-control and prove his physical indifference to lust, he put himself in the most tempting situations possible. If there was violence in the streets, Gandhi actually blamed himself. He believed some hidden, subconscious lust within him was causing the political failure.
Okay, so he essentially viewed his own body as like a spiritual generator for the entire nation.
That's a perfect way to put it.
But the collateral damage of that belief is just staggering. Reading this, it reminds me of a brilliant, completely obsessive wellness guru or scientist who decides to test a potentially lethal experimental methodology on his own family members without considering their well-being.
Right, yeah.
Like, the scientist is so blindly focused on the eventual cure for humanity that the psychological and physical toll on the people in his own home is completely invisible to him. He genuinely believes the end justifies the means.
That analogy perfectly captures the mechanism of his ego. because the extremity of his spiritual tests wasn't just an isolated quirk, it was the defining feature of his entire household.
It bled into everything.
Oh, totally. The absolute rigidity he demanded of himself bled directly into his family life, and it particularly affected his wife, Kasturba Gandhi.
Because in his mind, he elevated spiritual discipline far above basic physical survival.
Yes. The sources detail this fundamental tragic friction in their marriage, which was rooted in his belief in spiritual healing over modern medicine.
And this gets really dark.
It does. When Kasturba fell severely ill with pneumonia, Gandhi actively discouraged her from taking conventional medical treatment.
Even penicillin, right?
Exactly. Even penicillin, which was strongly recommended by doctors. He believed that adopting a diet of water and honey alongside spiritual faith was the only pure way to heal.
That is just, wow.
Yeah, he expected his family to adhere to his specific version of asceticism regardless of the physical cost. And Kasturba ultimately passed away from her illness.
So he essentially forced his own extreme asceticism onto his dying wife. I mean, the tension and resentment that must have created in that family is unimaginable.
It was immense.
And the sources show that this environment pushed his children to the breaking point. Most notably, his eldest son, Harilal.
Right. The expectations Gandhi placed on his family were so overbearing and morally rigid that Harilal just reached a state of profound rebellion.
He just wanted a normal life, basically.
Yeah, he wanted to marry, he wanted a formal education, a conventional career, all things his father actively blocked because Gandhi viewed them as corrupting worldly attachments.
So they completely fell out.
They did. The rift became so deep that Harilal eventually severed ties with his father entirely.
And reading through the historical context, Harilal didn't just walk away quietly to live his own life. He actively sought to dismantle his father's public image.
Oh, he went very public with his rebellion.
Yeah, Harilal actually briefly converted to Islam, taking the name Abdullah. And historians note this wasn't necessarily like a deep spiritual awakening. It was a calculated, highly public act of defiance designed to strike at the core of his father's Hindu identity and public standing.
Synthesizing this family dynamic reveals a crucial and honestly somewhat chilling aspect of Gandhi's character. He was a man so entirely consumed by the pursuit of a theoretical moral ideal that he completely detached from the basic human needs of his own flesh and blood.
The ideal of the Mahatma simply became more important than the individuals who loved him.
Exactly.
But that instinct to strictly categorize human behavior, to place moral purity on a rigid hierarchy, it didn't just appear out of nowhere in his later years.
No, it didn't.
It actually forces us to look back at his early career in South Africa, which is a period that completely fractures the popular origin story we are all taught.
Right, because the standard narrative usually skips straight to the famous 1893 train incident.
Right. The story goes that a young, newly minted lawyer named Gandhi is thrown off a train in Pietermaritzburg, South Africa, simply because he was a person of color sitting in a first-class compartment.
Yeah, we've all heard that one.
And supposedly, sitting in the freezing cold on that platform, he experiences this massive epiphany and immediately begins his lifelong crusade for universal human equality.
But the petitions he wrote and the journals he published during his 2 decades in South Africa reveal a much more uncomfortable reality.
Yeah.
He wasn't suddenly fighting for universal equality at all. Gandhi ran a journal there called Indian Opinion, and in its pages, he frequently used the word kafir to describe the native black South African population.
And we need to be absolutely clear about the weight of that word.
We do. It was a deeply derogatory racial slur. Basically, the primary weaponized language of the British colonial establishment.
And he wasn't using it accidentally.
No, the sources show he used it deliberately to politically and socially distinguish Indians from black Africans. He repeatedly petitioned the British authorities, arguing that Indians descended from a civilized, ancient culture and therefore should absolutely not be treated the same or housed in the same prison cells as the native black population, whom he explicitly described in his writings as uncivilized.
Wait, so in those early days, he wasn't fighting for universal equality at all?
Not at all.
Looking at this timeline, it completely breaks the myth. He accepted the colonial racial hierarchy entirely. He was just lobbying for Indians to be placed on a higher rung of the ladder, safely above black Africans.
Yes. Now, the historical community debates the nuances of this heavily.
Okay, what do the different camps say?
Well, historians like Ashwin Desai and Ghulam Vahid, who co-authored the South African Gandhi, argue that his early activism was undeniably exclusionary.
Like complicit in the system.
Exactly. They point to these texts as clear evidence that Gandhi was complicit in the anti-Black racism of the colonial structure. They argue he was solely interested in securing elite privileges for the Indian merchant class.
But other historians push back on that framing, right?
Yeah.
Suggesting we have to view him as a product of his time.
Yeah, conversely, historians like Nishikant Kolj, E.S. Reddy, and biographer B.R. Nanda argue that judging his early 20s by modern standards ignores his capacity for growth.
Right.
They suggest Gandhi arrived in South Africa heavily indoctrinated by the British colonial mindset. Their argument is that as he spent more time witnessing the brutal realities of the British Empire, his perspective slowly shifted.
Which is fair.
Yeah, they point to his later years where he did express solidarity with African rights movements.
The evolution might be there, but you cannot simply erase those early writings, because the real-world impact of that early racism isn't just historical trivia, it's actively playing out today.
Very much so.
In 2016, a coalition of students and faculty at the University of Ghana organized sustained protests, and they successfully forced the removal of a statue of Gandhi from their campus.
Great.
And their argument was incredibly straightforward and powerful. Like, why should African students walk past a monument honoring a man who explicitly documented his view that they were inferior?
The protests in Ghana really force us to confront how we memorialize historical figures. His journey was not a clean, straight line from ignorance to enlightenment. It was an incredibly messy, ongoing transformation.
Absolutely.
And that instinct to categorize people, that early acceptance of a social hierarchy in South Africa, traveled right back to India with him. We see that exact same hierarchical logic applied to the Hindu caste system.
Right. So when Gandhi returns to India and begins building his mass movement, he eventually turns his attention to the Dalit community.
The untouchables.
Yeah, the people who had been violently marginalized for centuries and labeled as untouchables at the very bottom of the Hindu caste structure. So Gandhi launches what he calls the Harijan movement.
And he coined that term, right?
He did. He coins the term Harijan for them, which translates to children of God. He stated his goal was to restore their dignity and integrate them into society.
Now, on the surface, a campaign to restore dignity sounds like noble progressive reform.
Of course.
But it was met with fierce, immediate, and highly articulate rejection from Dalit intellectuals. Most notably, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar.
Ambedkar was an incredible figure.
He really was a brilliant legal scholar, an economist, and a Dalit himself, who had lived the brutal reality of untouchability. He wrote a scathing critique titled, "What Congress and Gandhi Have Done to the Untouchables."
Wow. It's putting it right out there.
Oh, yeah. In it, his assessment of Gandhi's approach was intellectually brutal.
Because Ambedkar saw exactly what the underlying mechanism of Gandhi's reform was.
Exactly.
He argued that Gandhi was merely trying to soften the cruelest edges of the caste system, rather than actually destroying the system itself.
Ambedkar fundamentally understood that the Dalit community didn't need Gandhi's paternalistic sympathy. And they certainly didn't need a new, carefully chosen nickname.
Right.
To Ambedkar, the caste system was intrinsically violent because it dictated a human being's worth and occupation by birth. You cannot soften that. He demanded tangible political power, separate electoral representation, legal rights, and the total, uncompromising abolition of the caste hierarchy.
But the sources show Gandhi actively defended the traditional caste structure, known as the Varna system.
He did. Gandhi believed that the Varna system, which is the ancient division of society into 4 main occupational classes, was a functional, natural way to organize human civilization.
Wait, really?
Yeah, he theorized that if people simply followed their hereditary occupations, it would eliminate destructive capitalist competition and create a harmonious village-based economy.
Interesting.
His argument was that if you could somehow strip away the physical violence and remove the psychological concepts of superior and inferior, the hereditary system itself was beneficial.
Okay, so to put this ideological clash into perspective, to Ambedkar and the Dalits, Gandhi was basically trying to put a fresh coat of paint and some nice new curtains on a deeply toxic, condemned house.
Yes.
Meanwhile, they were standing outside begging for a wrecking ball to level the foundation.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize the friction. For Ambedkar, standing at the very bottom of that hierarchy, Gandhi's distinction between good hereditary caste and bad untouchability was totally meaningless. A hierarchy is a hierarchy.
Right.
This debate between Gandhi's defense of idealized traditionalism and Ambedkar's demand for radical structural justice remains one of the most significant, deeply unresolved historical debates in modern Indian politics.
So here is where the narrative becomes incredibly complex.
Yeah.
We are analyzing a man who struggled deeply with the basic concept of social equality. He lobbied for racial stratification in South Africa. He defended a sanitized version of the caste structure in India, and his moral rigidity completely alienated his own children.
It's a lot of baggage.
It is. How does a man burdened with all of those internal and external conflicts actually manage to unite a subcontinent and lead one of the most massive, successful independence movements in human history?
By taking that exact same inflexible personal moral compass we just discussed and forging it into a political weapon.
Ah, okay.
Gandhi's contribution to ending British rule is genuinely undeniable because he discovered a way to force the British Empire into a moral crisis. The empire knew how to fight armies. They did not know how to fight millions of people utilizing the sustained, relentless power of nonviolent resistance.
Right, but his method of leadership inside that movement was far from democratic.
Oh, totally. The sources actually describe his leadership style as a moral dictatorship.
Wait, a moral dictatorship?
Yeah. He wasn't simply leading a political coalition of diverse thinkers. He was leading a moral crusade. He demanded that his followers, especially his inner circle, adopt his specific, highly rigorous lifestyle.
Like the fasting and celibacy.
Exactly. To be part of his ashram and his core leadership, he expected you to fast, to practice strict celibacy, to spin your own cloth, and to adhere strictly to his absolute moral codes.
Which drove the pragmatic politicians in the independence movement absolutely crazy.
Oh, they hated it.
Figures like Subhas Chandra Bose, who wanted to take a militant, armed approach against the British, and again, Dr. Ambedkar, they found Gandhi's methods completely intolerable.
Right.
Because they were trying to run a strategic political revolution. And Gandhi would routinely stall clear, logical political steps based purely on his personal emotional investments in absolute peace.
They felt his obsession with moral purity was actively sabotaging practical revolution. There were critical moments in the struggle where calculated political maneuvers or continued mass protests were urgently needed to keep the pressure on the British.
And he would just stop.
Yeah, Gandhi would suddenly change direction or call off a nationwide movement entirely or go on a fast unto death, all based on his own internal moral calculations or if even a single act of violence occurred among the protesters.
Wow. And his relationship with the British Empire was incredibly contradictory from the start, too.
Oh, absolutely.
We think of him as this lifelong anti-colonial firebrand, born to tear down the Union Jack. But the historical record shows that for a significant portion of his life, he was a deeply loyal subject of the British Crown.
During his time in South Africa and even during the early years of World War I, he actively recruited Indians to serve in the British military.
He recruited for them.
He did. He genuinely believed that the British Empire, despite its flaws, was a fundamentally civilized, reformable institution. He worked within British legal and political frameworks for decades, believing that if Indians proved their loyalty, the empire would grant them equal rights.
So when did that change?
He didn't pivot to viewing the empire as a fundamental existential enemy until the Amritsar massacre in 1919. That event just totally shattered his faith in British justice.
But the contradictions pile up even higher when we look at a text like his famous 1909 manifesto, Hind Swaraj, or Indian Home Rule.
That's a fascinating text.
It is, because in that text, he is absolutely vicious in his critique of the West. He doesn't just attack British politics. He attacks modernity itself. He calls modern civilization a disease. He specifically condemns doctors, lawyers, and modern technology, like the railways, as a plague that corrupts the human soul.
Yeah, he viewed industrialization as a destructive force that stripped humanity of its spiritual essence. He was constantly advocating instead for a return to simple, self-sufficient village life.
Yet the irony is glaring.
Oh, it really is.
He masterfully used that exact same modern technology. The British built railway networks, the telegraph system, the printing press, to spread his anti-modernity message globally.
He was a brilliant communicator.
Exactly. He praised the absolute virtue of poverty and lived in a simple hut, but his massive political movements and his ashrams were heavily funded by incredibly wealthy Indian industrialist elites.
Yep.
It makes me wonder, looking at Hind Swaraj, was his rebellion less about anti-colonialism at first and actually more about a deep philosophical disappointment with industrial modernity itself?
That is a profound distinction to make. And the historian Ramachandra Guha, who has written extensively on Gandhi, suggests something similar. He argues that Gandhi's true, lasting contribution to world history was not political perfection, and it certainly wasn't ideological consistency.
Okay.
His ultimate contribution was the fact that he forcefully introduced a moral language into the ruthless realm of geopolitics.
Okay.
He forced a massive, mechanized empire to argue on moral grounds.
But in doing so, he set a moral benchmark for humanity so extraordinarily high that he couldn't even meet it himself.
Exactly. He demanded absolute saintliness in a world governed by messy, pragmatic politics.
And he certainly made life incredibly difficult and sometimes tragic for anyone in his orbit who couldn't keep pace with his impossible demands.
For sure. But the global impact of that moral language is staggering when you zoom out.
It really is.
Yeah.
You have this incredibly complex, contradictory man who held deeply problematic views on race and caste, who shattered his own family. But the specific tools he forged, the organized strategies of nonviolent resistance, of marching, of fasting, of economic boycotts, those went on to shape the entire trajectory of the 20th century.
Absolutely. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. during the American Civil Rights Movement and Nelson Mandela in South Africa took Gandhi's exact blueprint and used it to dismantle systemic oppression in their own nations.
And yet the incredible irony holds perfectly. The very man whose blueprint freed so many is actively protested in parts of Africa today, specifically because of the racial prejudices he harbored while forging those very tools.
It's the ultimate paradox. But to truly understand Gandhi, as Guha and other modern historians point out, you cannot freeze him as a static, flawless saint.
Right.
He was in a state of constant, incredibly messy evolution regarding race, regarding caste, regarding his family, and regarding what politics should even be. His greatness doesn't lie in the absence of mistakes or prejudices. It lies in his constant, agonizing, and sometimes completely failing struggle with his own imperfections on the world stage.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. We've looked at the private letters, the colonial protests, the tragic family fractures, and the brilliant, frustrating political maneuvers.
We see a man who was obsessive, deeply inflexible, and profoundly flawed.
A visionary who actively alienated his family and routinely infuriated his closest political allies. So think about this. If defeating a massive, entrenched global empire through nonviolent resistance required a leader with an ego so inflexible and a moral obsession so absolute that he was willing to sacrifice the well-being of his own family and the strategy of his allies, does true, world-changing political progress inherently require profoundly flawed, obsessive individuals at the helm? When you picture that saintly figure with the white clothes and the walking stick, maybe the most important thing to realize isn't just that the image is a myth. Maybe the real truth is that the myth and the revolution it sparked was only possible because of the deep, obsessive flaws hidden beneath it.